Good afternoon. During my first meeting with Justin, the operations manager, he said to me, listen, people get just a couple of chances to cross me and then I am done with them. And in this particular case, Justin was done with his peer named Linda. And here's a graphic illustration of Justin and Linda going at it in their workplace. And the reason that Justin was so upset with Linda was that these are two high-level managers, and she saw him one day in the parking lot getting into his car about 4:20 in the afternoon, and she glanced at her watch and she said, "Oh, Justin, I see you're clocking out for the day," in kind of a sarcastic tone. And for Justin, that was kind of the final straw. He felt that she had been insulting and disrespectful on a number of previous occasions. And so he cut her off cold turkey and decided he wasn't going to have anything to do with her anymore, and was just completely unresponsive when she would ask him questions or try to engage him during leadership meetings. He wouldn't look at her, wouldn't engage. She was really baffled by this. And by the time the CEO called me in about 2 years later, these folks had really taken their teams off the cliff, and the whole organization was in jeopardy because these two senior managers couldn't get along with each other. So folks out there that are part of the webinar today, I'm sure that you've seen these kind of wrecks before, seen how relationships that go awry in the workplace can cause a great deal of damage and really affect the organization as a whole. So we're here today to talk about this cheerful subject of conflict resolution and how to manage employees as a supervisor. So if your organization has people in it, I'm sure that you have been scorched by the heat of conflict. I appreciate you being here today. My name is Chris Sheasley, and I'm here as a conflict resolution professional. I've done this work for 25 years, and basically my tagline is, I fix workplace conflict. So when organizations get into these situations and they haven't been able to resolve it themselves, then I come in and try to help folks work it out. So the four things we're going to do together today, one is to look first at the cost of conflict, understand the impact that conflict can have on your team and on your organization. We're going to look at the blocks and the four apparent barriers of what gets in the way of conflict resolution. We're going to take a slight detour to a third point, which is about impartiality and how important that theme is for being an effective manager. And finally, I'm not going to leave you hanging here. I'm going to come back and talk to you about the procedures and the steps for overcoming the four apparent barriers to good conflict resolution. So that's the journey that we're on in the next 55 minutes here. So quantifying conflict is kind of a difficult thing to do, but I imagine that you all have had your experience with conflict and your own anecdotal experience with it. So the question for you all is kind of what is the cost of conflict and how do you measure that in your own work life? And as you reflect on that question, I'm sure you're coming up with things like morale and losing people, good people, and having negative effects of people getting their work done and productivity. So this is kind of a hard concept to quantify, but I want to give you a chance to try it out here, and we're going to give you a chance to do some polling. I have first question. According to some research on the impact of conflict in organizations, poor relationships cause blank % of performance problems. So according to this research, and you have 5 options here, what percentage of problems are caused not by lack of motivation or lack of skill, but by lack of ability to get along with each other? So we're going to launch the poll.
It's launched.
Great. So your best guess on this research?
It looks like we have 10% of participants have voted 40%, 51% for 65%, and 37% for 90%.
All right, good deal. Well, of course, this is going to be different for all different organizations and contexts, but in this kind of cross-organizational study, I think we're just in the majority here, folks. When I heard 51% saying number 3, that is correct for this particular research study. So 65% of performance by relationship issues. That's pretty staggering if you think about the impact of conflict and ability for people to get their work done. I have two more questions for you, and I'm going to share some more astonishing statistics with you. This one is about people leaving. This one invariably comes up when I ask people about their own experience with conflict in their workplaces. So what percentage of departures are because of unresolved conflict? So again, you have 5 choices, maybe only 4 choices if you look at some of the faulty math on number 5 there. But so what percentage of departures are due to chronic conflict?
Wow, so 42% have voted for the 50%, 12% for 25, another 41% for the 80.
All right, good. So once again, our majority of folks got the right answer, number 3, 50% of departures due to chronic unresolved conflict. So I think you're starting to get the theme here that conflict is expensive in terms of losing people, in terms of the performance and the function of people on the job. Now the grand finale here is for you all as supervisors and managers. How much of your time do you spend dealing with staff conflict? So here you have, again, 5 choices.
It looks like 65% of managers spend 65% of their time dealing with.
Wow.
Yeah.
So most people said 60%.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, again, this is going to be different for all different organizations, but according to this same research study, it was 18% of the time. So I might have tricked you all into thinking that the middle one was the correct answer on all of these, but this one is 18%. But still, if you translate that into time of effort in a given week, that's basically a day a week that the average typical manager is spending dealing with conflict in their organization. So as you can see, you add all that together and you recognize that conflict is quite expensive for organizations, and you have to ask yourselves, are you all overstaffed, or do you have extra time to deal with conflict and people problems in your organization? I suspect that most of us don't have that luxury, and yet we have to deal with conflict. So in my experience, most supervisors are sophisticated and able to deal with many different kinds of conflicts, but there are still some upgrades that you can get to your toolkit and your ability to address conflict. So today I'm going to give you some tools that are easy to remember and easy to apply no matter how hot the conflict gets in your organization. So let's take a look at another dimension of this. I'm going to explore what makes conflict so hot and so uncomfortable, and then we'll take a look at this using some cases that I've addressed as a professional mediator for workplaces. Here's another one. You met Justin and Linda before, but now I'd like to introduce you to Shelly and her colleague, her subordinate employee, Ted. So Shelly, she thought she was doing pretty good as a manager until one day the boss, the big boss, comes in and sits down in her office, and that was unusual for her, so she was already kind of on edge, and then he informed her that one of her employees came to him and said that she was being accused of violence in the workplace. And the person that was complaining was this employee of hers. Shelly was rather shocked by this because she actually thought she had a good rapport with Ted, so she was very discouraged and upset to hear this, and particularly that at her level in the organization she was being accused of being guilty of violence in the workplace. And she asked, of course, what this was all about, and it turned out that Ted felt that he was being belittled by her, and he was working as her administrative assistant, and he had worked for the previous supervisor in her role, and when he took over, or when she took over, she kind of inherited Ted. So he never felt that she really wanted him in this role, and felt that it was not something that was going well from her perspective, and he kept feeling that she was taking away work and diminishing his job and his duties. So one day there was this kind of perfect match on this pool of gasoline when she was in a staff meeting with they were trying to figure out who was going to do this little task, and she kind of waved her hand in the air and said in a very dismissive way, "Oh, well, Ted can take care of that detail." So for him, that translated into violence and belittlement, and he went up to the big boss to lodge his complaint. So we're going to use the story of Shelly and Ted to look at the 4 barriers to conflict resolution. Now, this is what I've distilled from 25 years of intervening in conflicts in the organizations and figuring out what are the recurring themes that I see all the time. So the first one I want to introduce you to is the idea of violated expectations. At the heart of every conflict in the workplace, there's a violated expectation. People break rules that are important to others and to each other. Now the problem is, of course, that we don't have these expectations about how we want to be treated or how we want people to act towards us. We don't have those written on our cubicle walls, or we don't have them on our t-shirts. It's something that we don't really know is there until we make a mistake and we treat somebody in a way that they didn't expect to be treated. So all of us have these expectations, and it's very evident that this is the key central point in all conflicts across organizations. So as you think about Shelly and Ted, I'd like you to consider what were some of the rules that Shelly had? What was her expectation? Now, she sounded like she was the perpetrator according to Ted, but she had her own expectations. If you reflect on that for a moment, you'll likely come up with her biggest grievance in this situation was that Ted didn't come to her directly, that he violated the norm of just talking with somebody directly about the concern. Now, of course, he had lots of reasons why he didn't go to her directly, but her rule was broken, and she was extraordinarily upset that she first heard about this from her boss. And then you think about Ted's expectations and his rules. Well, there were several, but one was that he not be disrespected in front of his peers, another that he be treated with respect and dignity in terms of his work. He wanted what all of us want, is to come to work every day and to add some value to the organization and not be put down in that task. So this is the first hurdle that we face in conflict, is this idea that everybody has rules and we invariably break them, and when the relationship breaks rules, then things get even more tenuous. So think about it logically. What happens next? And I'm going to apologize in advance for the graphic nature of this next slide, which is the next major problem is that when somebody is breaking our rules, it's easy for us to feel like a victim. Like we are the targets of the flamethrowers that they're aiming at us, and they are clearly doing it on purpose. And we have lots of stories that we make up in our minds about their intentions and the effect that it has on us. So we end up feeling like victims. And folks, this is not just scapegoating. People are not just saying that they're a victim because that makes them sound better. It's a genuine conviction. People that are in conflict and have had their rules violated by the other person genuinely believe that they are the victim of the other person's negativity or the other person's actions. You yourselves feel this almost instantly. You know, how many milliseconds does it take you to feel defensive or that you're being victimized by the other person? So I've witnessed this in the thousands of cases that I've addressed over the years. That I can talk to one side, I can talk to Shelly and hear her story, and boy, I end up feeling bad for her internally, and then I talk to Ted and I feel just as bad for him. Both parties end up feeling like victims. Now, in your experience, again, I'd like you to think about how both of these people felt like victims in that case. So if you think of, again, Ted felt like he was being belittled, put in his place, and not really given much response to the job. And Shelly, of course, felt that she had an employee who she actually had some rapport with. A little anecdote on her is that she actually would pick him up during snow days. He was from the South, and those rare snow days when he couldn't drive himself in, she would pick him up, and they had kind of that carpool type rapport as well. So that relationship was violated in her mind, and she ended up feeling very victimized by his unwillingness to talk to her directly. So I'd like you to think about a case that you are either involved in personally or that you've seen in your workplace, and I'm going to give you an opportunity here to think about how both sides in that situation are victims. So for some of this, I'd like to ask you to just jot down some thoughts here, or at least think about how each side in a case that you're experiencing in your work world demonstrate this idea of victimhood. And simultaneously, you might think about ways in which there are expectations that have been violated by both sides in the situation that you're considering. All right. So we've taken 2 steps now. We know that people break rules, and when they break our rules, we end up feeling like victims. So we're well on our way into very difficult and seemingly intractable conflict situations. Let's take a look at the 3rd barrier to conflict resolution, and that is, if you break my rules, I feel like a victim, and the next logical step is that I'm going to start to vilify you. I'm going to assume that if you're doing all of this, you're doing it on purpose, and you're doing it to make me feel bad and to damage me in some way. That it's no longer about the issue, but that you are now my enemy. So if you also think about situations that you yourself have been involved in or trying to manage issues for your team, you understand that it's very quick for people to get to the point where whatever the other person does starts to be seen through this lens of negativity. And it's almost like we have special goggles that we put on just for the other person that we have conflict with. We assume that when they, well, let's imagine that Shelly's walking past Ted's desk and she says, Ted, I'm going to go to that meeting this afternoon. And he says, oh, well, how long are you going to be gone? So I'm going to give you 2 options here, folks. When he asks that question, option A, Shelly thinks A, oh, he's my administrative assistant, needs to know where I'm going to be, and is going to do his job by making note of my whereabouts and timing, and so he can help direct people to me. So that's option A. Option B, as they spiral into this conflict, option B is she thinks, oh, that meddling, irksome person is trying to imply just by his very question that I leave the office too often and shouldn't be out of my office, and that I have no right to schedule my own calendar. So I assure you that as people get deep into conflict with each other, they almost always choose option B, which is to take the worst interpretation of the other person's actions and questions and comments. So this is obviously where we are now getting deep into the conflict. We vilify the other person, and I'd like you to consider this in your world, again, looking at your case. In which ways have people vilified each other? So I encourage you to think about that in your particular case. All right, so we're going to do a quick pop quiz here. You have 5 choices here, and the question is, which of these 3 out of 5 have we actually addressed at this point? So I'm going to ask you to highlight the 3 that we've actually talked about so far, and we got 1 more big one to go.
So we have vilify the other, feel like a victim, and violate expectations.
All right, I knew you all were a sharp group, so you've got it. So those are the big 3 that kind of get us started and deep into the conflict. The next phase of this intractable conflict that we end up getting into with each other and seeing our employees get into with each other is that by the time we see it, there's usually a huge kind of bonfire of issues and problems and history. People have piled things on, and they've added, files and history and comments and dirty looks, and all of that stuff is just piled on, and the fire grows bigger and bigger, and it spreads like a wildfire. So the question for us as conflict resolvers is to consider this phenomenon that conflicts tend to do what over time? They tend to get bigger, right? And they spiral out of control. And it's because of the previous three things that we looked at, but this becomes a factor in itself. The conflict really takes on a life of its own. If you think about what Ted wanted at the beginning of this and where they are now, it's really hard to tell what he was really concerned about at the start. Now it's about HR investigations, it's about the director being involved, it's about people splitting into two different teams and factions, and I've had cases where people decide which side they're going to be on by who they take walks with during lunch in the afternoon, and just who they interact with. So people become factionalized and split, and the whole thing gets big and crazy. But what's lost in all of that is what did it really start with, and what was really important to people in the conflict at the start. So that's why we have this kind of buried root cause that's so hard to decipher as the conflict has grown out of control. All right, so that's the bad news. I wanted to give you all the bad news first so you can get a sense of this dynamic of conflict, and we're going to do a quick recap for you here. The first thing is that he violated my expectations. So what do I feel like? I feel like I'm a victim. And then what do I think about him? What I think about him is he's just a horrible person and is doing this on purpose. And then the grand finale, of course, is that the conflict becomes out of control and we don't know what it's even about anymore. All right, so that's all the bad news. Now I want to give you a way out of this madness and take a look at the solutions to these different dilemmas that I've framed for you and that are so prevalent in workplace conflict. Here's a great quote from John Gardner, the former Secretary of Health. And don't worry, I never heard about him either, but he has a great quote here, and it's, we're continually faced by great opportunities, a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as insoluble problems. So basically, these problems that I've addressed for you all and underscored for you are, in fact, the solutions to the conflict. And I'm going to walk you back through each of these and show you how you can use each of these barriers as a way to leverage your way out of the conflict and help your employees get to a better place beyond the conflict. But first, I want to take a slight detour. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a skill and a mindset that's essential for good conflict resolution as a supervisor that you have to be skillful with in order to be successful in dealing with any of the tools and the techniques that I'm going to share with you a little bit later on. And that is this idea of impartiality. So impartiality is a critical component of being able to deal with conflict among your team. So the first question for you on this is, are any of us truly neutral or impartial? And I would suspect that most of us, if we're honest, are not, in fact, neutral. I myself am billed as a professional outside neutral, but the truth is I have opinions about the people I deal with, and I have my own points of view about people that I interact with. I just met with some clients this morning and certainly had a strong feeling that the person I was talking to is probably a large part of the problem. Or, for example, I had a case once where supervisor met with an employee with me as a mediator, and the manager had a file, probably at least a half an inch thick, of complaints from customers about this employee, and yet the employee still felt like the manager just had a personal vendetta against her. So does it sound like I had an opinion in that case? I did. But the key, and what I want to emphasize for you all, is even though it's hard not to have an opinion, the key to good resolution and to play the role of resolver is to not be transparent about your opinion, at least initially. So what you can do, if you can't be neutral, is you can treat people with impartial regard. And what this means is that we need to keep our opinions out of it. We don't have to be neutral, but we need to, as good conflict resolvers, allow people to be neutral. Now, why, or allow people to have their opinions without us interjecting our own thoughts into how they should solve the problem, for example. Why is this so critical? We have to go back, or we can go back here 400 years or so for a great description of what this is all about. It's basically that people are more likely to follow through with ideas that they themselves have come up with than ones that we come up with for them. So this is the power of conflict resolution, and the meaning of being impartial is to allow people that have the conflict to be the ones to come up with their own solution to it. So what this means is that in my experience, people are able to come up with ideas that we never would have thought of for them. I had a case a while ago where the employee left the organization, turned around and claimed discrimination, and in that process, the employee said that the company was treating her unfairly, etc. And we spent many hours trying to figure out how to solve this. At one point, late in the case, when I thought it was probably a lost cause, the company said, you know what, we have one last offer. We're going to give you a delivery van. It was a delivery company. We'll give you a delivery van, and we'll give you the opportunity to set up your own kind of micro delivery company in the small town you live in. We know you've expressed an interest in that before. Anyway, she accepted it, and they shook hands and had a deal. And I'm here to tell you that if I had mediated that case for 1,000 years, I probably never would have come up with that solution. It was something that emerged from their discussion. And my point in highlighting this is just to underscore that people come up with clever solutions that are ones that we never would have thought of. And the litmus test is that it's going to work for them. And it doesn't work even if it's not something we thought would work. So my takeaway on this whole point, the whole idea of impartiality is to allow the solutions to emerge from the parties and the employees to the extent you're able to do that. Now we'll talk at the end of the conversation here about some of how that fits with your being a supervisor and the expectation that you are supposed to at times make decisions and tell people what to do, of course. I'm not dismissing that, but I'm saying when it's possible and to the extent you can, if you can front load some impartiality into your interactions with your employees, and that can be a very powerful tool that you can use to help them resolve the conflict. So I want to just also say that sometimes I have to force myself to remain impartial. So I know it's hard for me, and so it's going to be hard for you all because in particular you know the people and you have a special role in your organization. Nonetheless, impartial regard is a very powerful thing. So there's two things I want you to remember about this. First of all is that just having kind of temporary impartiality is sometimes all that it takes, just to kind of withhold judgment and allow them to talk and share and come up with a solution that's going to work for them. And the second point, of course, is to allow the resolution to emerge from the people that are embedded in the conflict. You have to believe, ultimately, for this to work, that they have the answer within, and it's just a matter of you helping them come up with their own best solution to their own problem. All right, so you might think that's all easy to say and hard to do, and I certainly will agree with you, but you're not on your own. I have some tips and tricks for you to get back into this and to consider how to resolve the conflicts that are live. So we're going to move into kind of the skills here of how to deal with the conflicts. All right, so to do this, I want to give you another case example. I have two folks here, and this fellow's name was Hank, and he was sitting at his office one day, and he was typing away, looking at his computer. He got an email from his colleague down the hall, Julie, and it was Julie pulling out of a project that they had been working on for about 6 months, and she did it in an email. So he went down the hall and kind of opened up her door without really knocking. She's sitting in there with a couple of her staff having a meeting, and she looked up shocked and surprised, and he said, I need to talk to you right now. She said, well, I'm obviously not available. No, right now. You got to talk to me right now. I can't believe that email you just sent me. Anyway, they had quite a conversation about this, and she left the meeting with her staff and went across the hall, and they really had quite a blow-up. So this relationship was another one that went off the rails pretty quick and had some expectations violated. If you think about Hank's expectations, you might consider that if she's going to make a big announcement or withdraw from a project, then she should have the respect to do it in person and directly. And for Julie, of course, the expectation is that she's not going to be pulled out of a meeting or yelled at in front of her staff by one of her peers. So everybody has their expectations, and in this case, once again, they were broken. So the question for us as good conflict resolvers, as we think about Ted and Shelly and Hank and Julie and these other folks that you are working with, what's the solution to the problem of the violated expectation? The solution is relatively simple. It's just to reveal and to deal with the rules. So the question is, if we don't know what the other person's problem is, or what their rules are, or why they're being responding in the way that they are, then the best thing we can do is to try to explore what those rules are. And the way we do that is by asking questions such as these. So what specifically do you want the other person to do differently? Or why did you find it so frustrating when she blanked? Or what is she asking you to do to communicate differently? So those are the kinds of questions that will help you get to the rules that the other person has, and to be able to resolve the conflict, at least begin the conversation by being clear about how they might solve it. So Hank might say, when he cools down a little bit, that he wants Julie to express his concerns with him in or changes in policy and how she's going to work with him, to do that in person, in conversation, rather than hiding behind an email. And so that's the first step then, is to reveal and deal with it. So the second problem we addressed earlier was dealing with victimhood. So there are really two parts to dealing with victimhood. And the first one is kind of embedded in what I was saying when I first introduced this concept of victimhood. And it's that the victimhood that they feel is a genuine conviction. It's not just making themselves look good or trying to make the other person look bad. It's really a genuine feeling of victimhood. Again, I encourage you to think about your own experience with conflict, in that most of us feel pretty instantaneously victimized by what other people might do or say. So the solution to this is to listen, and to listen to what the person's victimization is all about. Even if we don't agree with it inside, this is where impartiality comes into play. We do all the things you know how to do already, such as active listening and empathizing and summarizing what they're saying. It's all that stuff. And the question is, why do we listen? And there are lots of good reasons to listen, too. We listen so that we understand the situation better, so that we build some understanding and some trust even. But I want to give you kind of a secret agenda here. And this might sound a little strange coming from a professional peacemaker, but one of the reasons I listen to people is so that I can get into a position where I'm able to sow doubt. What I mean by this is you get to a point, if you've listened well and you've built up that trust and rapport, then you've earned permission to sow doubt. And by that I mean you are starting to ask questions that really call into question their version of reality, that they are the victim and the other person is the perpetrator. So you do this with genuine curiosity, and you start to ask questions, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, that will help them think about their situation and the other person in a different way. Here's some questions that have this character to them. So if you could redo it, what would you do differently? I almost always end up asking people that kind of question. Is there anything you did that you regret about what you did? What did you do that you wish that you might have done differently if you had the chance to do it over again? When I talk to him about you, what's he going to say about you? And this one can be quite powerful. I used it recently with a client. I said, what's she going to say about you? Well, she's going to call me, I know what she's going to say. She's horrible. She's going to say I'm disorganized, unprofessional, and rude. And I had enough rapport with her at that point that I was able to say, and which of those three rang true the most? And it really got her to pause and think. And she said, well, I can be pretty disorganized. And now she and I are talking about the impact of her disorganization on her working relationship with her colleague, rather than her just defensiveness and victimhood about how horrible the colleague is. So this idea of sowing doubt, being able to ask questions that convert from victimhood towards a more introspection on their own part in the conflict is a very powerful turning point in many conflict situations. So it's been said that a negotiator tries to plant doubt in the other person's mind. So if I'm selling you a car, you know, you're going to come and look at it and tell me all the reasons it's not worth what I'm asking, and I'm going to tell you all the reasons it is. So we're each trying to get each other to doubt the other person's point of view. Well, a good conflict resolver, in some ways, tries to plant doubt in everybody's mind. So not just the other person, but in both of the people, in this case, both employees' minds, to get them to think about, well, maybe my version isn't completely accurate. So these are the kinds of questions that can help us do that. And by the way, one of the interesting things about the case with Shelly and Ted, where he had gone to the big boss, when we really talked about that and I was able to get to a point with him where he was more comfortable, I asked him how he felt in retrospect about going to the director. And he said, well, you know, truth is, that's the biggest thing I regret in this whole dynamic. I just went to the director because I thought I could have an informal chat with him. And he kind of took it and ran with it and made a much bigger deal out of it. I guess he heard the word violence and really ran with it and took it to HR and basically overdid it. And so that was a very damaging part. So when she, of course, Shelly heard this, she was able to let go a bit of the feeling that he was just out to get her and was trying to do damage to her. So it was a very powerful turning point in that particular case. But we wouldn't have gotten there if we hadn't had good rapport and asked questions and been able to sow some doubt for folks. All right, so on this one, you need to have deep, impartial listening so you can then be able to sow doubt. So those are the two takeaways from dealing with victimhood: impartial listening and the ability to sow doubt. So let's take a look at the next one, this idea that the other person is really a villain. So if you think about people you've seen interact negatively with each other and how they vilify each other, how accurate is that perception? In most cases, it's really an overstatement, just as you see on this kind of comical slide here. It's really somewhere between the two. And so your job as a good conflict resolver on the issue of vilification is to try to reveal this skewed view and explore alternative explanations for why people are acting the way they are. And again, just as before, I want to give you some questions that might help you get there with your employees. So questions like, what other reasons might there be for why she or he said that? Or, you know, what were you hoping to convey when you did that? And I end up asking this question, not early in most cases, but later on, what do you appreciate about each other? So even in these extraordinarily feisty and intense cases that, that organizations kick out to an external consultant like me, even in those cases, people are able to come up with things that they appreciate about each other. And again, that can be quite powerful. So your job as a good conflict resolver then is to kind of dismantle this idea that people are all bad and get them to think about it. There's kind of the classic question you might ask at some point, why would a reasonable person do that? And wait for a legitimate answer. So in that case with Hank and Julie, where he came down the hall screaming at her, it turned out in our conversation and the work with them that at one point he actually was her mentor, and she came to work for that organization because of him. He had recruited her. And so they were able to get back to that and to look beneath the surface of their current conflict at what they actually at one time had respected about each other. So again, that can be very powerful in working with with and through the conflict. So a quick summary for where we are right now is to reveal the rules, to challenge the victim myth, and to provide some alternative explanations for the behavior. All right. So the last barrier, you'll recall, is the buried root cause. So what I would like to encourage you to think about here is how to dismantle that one is to look for what's really important. So remember the bonfire analogy. It's so bright and so many things have been piled on top that we don't even care anymore what it's about. We just want to do damage to the other person. So in the resolution process, the trick is to ultimately figure out what's really important. And we do that again with asking great questions, things like, what are your core concerns? You keep insisting on this solution. What's important to you about that solution? And as simple as, what did you want to achieve when this whole thing began? So those are some of the kinds of questions that you can ask to get beyond the problem of the conflict being difficult to discern what's really important. In the end, it doesn't matter what specific questions you ask, rather it's kind of the spirit in which you ask them. And so in my mind, the skillful conflict resolver asks questions about why. So why is this important to you? Why do you want to pursue it this way? Why were you upset about it? What concerned you about it? So those are the kind of questions that can be quite powerful. In the Ted and Shelly case, by the way, Ted, as I indicated before, felt that she never wanted him in his role as her administrative assistant. And in the resolution process, and so much of what happened afterward flowed from that. He felt that she was dismissing him and putting him down and taking away his work, all because he really didn't want her in that role. So in this resolution effort, he was able to look her in the eye and ask her that question directly, and she was able to dispel that concern that he really did want her, she wanted him in his role, and was able to clarify that in a way that was meaningful to him and help them get through that conflict. So for digging for the buried root cause, you just need to refocus on the initial problem, figure out what started the concerns, and then reveal what really matters and work on that instead of all the fluff. Now, this doesn't mean you get to ignore all the other issues that have happened, but you do need ultimately to focus on what's at the core of the conflict. So there you have the solutions to the conflict, and we're going to do another little quick quiz here, but this one is on your honor. Without looking back at the materials, try to reconstruct the 4 barriers and the 4 solutions. So there were more than 4 solutions to each barrier, but I want to get you to at least reconstruct the 4 barriers that we described, and then ask you to come up with a solution, at least one solution to each of the 4 barriers. I'll give you all a couple of moments to do that, and then we'll do another activity in a moment. Okay, so hopefully you all passed the test. Again, this is kind of on Scout's honor that you didn't look back at your materials. But just to summarize again, we have the violated expectations is the first barrier, and a solution to violated expectations is to reveal and deal with the concern. The next barrier is dealing with victimhood and the problem that people feel like victims. And our job as good conflict resolvers, again, is to listen to their concern, to kind of validate the victimhood, but then move beyond it by sowing doubt and asking questions that kind of get them to rethink their sense of victimhood. Vilification is the third barrier, and the problem there, of course, is that we think the worst of the other person. So we think of the Mother Teresa and the devil slide there, and recognize that if we can get people to look at each other more realistically, then they'll have a different perspective. And the grand finale, of course, is the root cause gets buried underneath all of the conflict and all the dynamics of conflict. And so our job is to figure out what those root issues are and ask good questions. So you'll certainly notice that a recurring theme in all of this are not statements or things that we say to our staff and to our employees, but rather the questions we ask that help them kind of unearth their own solutions to their own problems. For our grand finale activity, I'd like to ask you all to think about this scenario and reflect back on the case that I've been asking you to kind of conjure up in your own experience. So to assume that in that situation you have earned permission to sow doubt, you've been a good listener, you've stayed impartial, and you've been able to get them to trust that you're going to not just tell them what to do, but rather help them come up with some solutions. So I'd like you to come up with questions that would challenge the victimhood, de-vilify the other person, might reveal a rule or unearth a core need. So again, I'm going to give you a moment here to just reflect on that, jot down a question or two for your case in particular that would have any of these 4 features. So I'll give you 30 seconds for that. Okay, so with your questions in hand, I encourage you to try them out with your staff or in the case that you were considering today. But speaking of questions, I want to give you all a chance to ask your questions of me and to explore this topic a little bit further. So in the last 10 minutes here, anybody have questions or inquiries about any of the things we've covered or situations you're grappling with in conflict in your work world? So it doesn't look like we have any questions that are in just yet. What I'm going to encourage you all to do is to develop a plan for dealing with conflict that you've been considering today. Hopefully you've gotten some new additional tools for how to address those situations, and would encourage you to be like these folks. You know, the second half of this, these folks run in when everybody else is running out. So it's like that in conflict. We're often averse to it. It seems kind of scary and uncomfortable. But as good conflict resolvers and managers, it's really our responsibility to go towards the heat instead of running away from it. And that's kind of one of my mantras in conflict resolution, is to fight that urge to flee, but rather recognize that the heat is a signal that we need to go towards it rather than away from it. And I've given you some tools to think about and techniques that will help you be effective in going into the conflict rather than running the opposite direction.
Okay, so we have our first question. Can you talk a bit about someone who's upset because they've been passed over for a promotion?
Okay, sure. So in that scenario, I think the key is going to be to do the good listening and to find out, you know, what's going on for that person. We might assume that we know, just that it's because they're not going to get more money or more recognition, and we could probably all list, if I asked you to just list all the reasons that person's upset, you could probably come up with, you know, 25 different reasons why they're upset. The person that knows, though, and the person whose opinion, of course, matters on this is the person that was passed over for the promotion. So what I would encourage is that we ask them and talk to them and interact and find out specifically for them what the concern is, and do that through the kind of impartiality that I was describing throughout this presentation, so that we can help them express and articulate their concern. And then, of course, from there forward, it's so what do we do to help you be more successful with the next opening and the next possibility? And then, of course, checking back with the person to make sure that that you heard them and that they feel like they're on a track that's going to be more constructive for them.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is, what do you do with repeat offenders?
So I guess I'll preface this by saying that a lot of the work that I'm describing and what you're encouraged to do here does require that the people you're working with are fixable, that they're not just in the conflict because they are getting stimulated by being in conflict. And we all, of course, know people that are difficult. So I'd like to caution you all, though, to not think, well, this all sounds great, but it's just not going to work with Fred or Sally or whoever that person you might have in mind that's kind of a frequent flyer into conflict. Even the best mediators and conflict resolvers don't solve them all, and so that there's going to be folks that you're just not going to be able to work with and work through the conflict. And happily, in organizational life, there's other tools, techniques that are available to you, and procedures and progressive discipline and other things that you have available to you. But my core point is not to not try just because you think the person isn't going to be receptive to it, or that they've been in other conflicts so that they've demonstrated this history. It might be that they're demonstrating the history because the efforts to resolve the conflict haven't been successful, or you haven't applied these kind of techniques of really listening to their point of view, that you've already made up your mind about who they are, and they're just a troublemaker, or they're always in conflict. In my line of work, if people keep repeating behaviors, it's often because they don't feel that they're being addressed or that their underlying needs are being met. So I would encourage in those situations to really find out what's driving that. The other thing I'd encourage you to consider is to point out the behavior. So rather than just dealing with each episode as it comes up in isolation, kind of take a step back at the higher level and highlight the pattern. It's said in my line of work that sometimes people play ping pong across the table with each other, but the whole time they're kicking a bowling ball at each other underneath the table. So instead of dealing with the ping pong ball, good conflict resolvers need to kind of reach down, pick up the bowling ball, and put that on the table. And in the case of a frequent flyer who's often in conflict, that's the bowling ball. And so you can say, in my experience with you over the last X period of time, you've had multiple conflicts, and I want to find out more about what that's about. And let's talk about that pattern rather than this latest episode that's occurred. So make it transparent.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question here. How do you recommend dealing with a narcissist?
Well, let's see. I think that's another kind of recurring theme in conflict resolution, is that we're going to experience people who are very self-focused. And I guess I'd like to question the label a little bit about calling somebody a narcissist, which has lots of assumptions built around it, that's a character flaw, or that they are somewhat, somewhere on the spectrum of personality disorder. I'd actually like to argue that when we're in conflict and we reach that second step of the barrier, most of us are narcissistic. We feel like we're victims, that the other person is out to get us, and that we're going to be really focused on our own stuff. I mean, it can be remarkable. Again, when I meet with people for the first time, hearing them describe how they've been treated by the other person, and in my impartial, kind of neutral perspective, I can almost imagine what the other person must be experiencing when they try to deal with the person I'm sitting in front of. And yet the person I'm dealing with has all these concerns about how horribly the other person has treated them. My point here is that if we kind of label somebody as narcissistic, then it's easy to dismiss the authentic concerns that they might have, and that it's a more effective conflict resolution strategy than to think about what they're experiencing, and to find out why they feel the way they do. Now again, there's those 5%, the 5%ers or whatever, that are truly narcissistic, and you're not going to get through. And so again, you have other options for addressing that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, and for the next question, when an employee is bad-mouthing coworkers and the boss, how can you turn that around and see their side?
Sure. So on this issue of gossip and bad-mouthing, and it goes back to a little bit to narcissism too. You can't change people. So if this person is a perpetual gossip, if you're dealing with somebody who has a very self-focused, you can't really change that. And I like to be upfront with people when I start my work with them that that's not going to be the outcome, no matter how much they might like to have the magic wand waved and have the other person become somebody different. Instead, what I encourage people to consider is behavior, and that behavior is changeable and negotiable. So if the behavior is damaging to the organization and to productivity and to team morale, etc., then that can become a point of discussion and negotiation. So using your example of the concern about somebody bad-mouthing others, well, rather than try to psychoanalyze and figure out everything that might be going on for that person, another approach is simply to negotiate about that behavior and the impact of it. So what specifically is the person doing? Who are they talking to? Kind of what's the theme of the kind of things that they're saying? And is there any legitimacy to what they're saying? That might be another approach too, to actually hear what they have to say. So it involves a lot of listening, trying to figure out their perspective, and ultimately, though, setting up parameters. And when I say negotiation, obviously in a supervisory role, you have more power in these negotiations. But you can still consider ways in which you can say, well, here are my expectations about saying things or not saying them to colleagues, and how you come across and how that affects the team. But what do you need to feel like you're being heard? And they might say, well, you canceled the staff meeting 6 months ago, and we haven't had any other forums to raise our concerns. So again, this is wildly hypothetical, but you hear that they have some need that's not being met. Well, that might be a legitimate one, that staff meetings give people a forum or a private complaint box or some other way for them to express their concern. That's the kind of negotiation I'm describing.
One more.
Yes.
Okay. And our last question is why a question that makes people defensive?
Yes, I've heard that too, that if we ask why, and it really has a lot to do with the tone and the implication. If we already know the answer and we're asking why, then that can put people on the defense. In my experience, another thing that gets put down or discouraged are yes or no questions is another example. But I've found that I don't split hairs on this kind of exact way of phrasing the question. For me, what's much more important is how the spirit in which we ask questions. So all these questions that I'm encouraging you all to consider in your work through conflict, the technique, the exact phrasing, the word why or not, all that's kind of secondary to what's your intention. And if you are genuinely curious, if you really want to know, then the why question can be very effective. So curiosity, in my experience, is more important than any particular phraseology that you put around it. It looks like that's about our time together.
We're about out of time.
Okay. So I appreciate the chance to chat with you. Appreciate your interest in this subject. I wish you the best of luck in your conflict resolution endeavors, and hope it works out for you. So thank you very much.